all about the long term. We're always thinking about not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, not this political cycle, but over the next 10 to 20 years. A progressive would say, to quote John Maynard Keynes, in the long run, we're all dead. I would just take Keynes out of context a little bit. But it does make the point that progressive approaches to monetary policy is that it's primarily about stimulating and directing the economy to stimulate growth in that particular way. Of course, the conservative would say, well, there's a big risk of doing that because the big risk associated with that is you're going to have inflationary problems.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo and Johnny.
Today, our guest is Dr. Sam Gregg, Distinguished Fellow in Political Economy and Senior Research Faculty Member at the American Institute for Economic Research, and author of 16 books and over 400 articles. Dr. Gregg is joining us today to help us and our listeners better understand issues relating to economics that are on all Americans' minds right now, including inflation. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Gregg.
Johnny, great to be with you, and thanks to ISI for having me on.
Before we get started with our interview, I'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you would like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Dr. Gregg, as Johnny said, we should probably start on the subject that's on everyone's minds right now, although as depressing as it may be. We haven't seen this rate of inflation in roughly 40 years, I believe I saw. And there was a report today that actually said the Fed is meeting today to discuss ways to tackle inflation, which could mean raising rates after two previous hikes that were made this spring. So could you explain this very complex subject and perhaps why inflation is seemingly so out of control right now?
Well, thanks very much. Inflation, of course, is a complicated subject. There's multiple causes, but the main cause, as Milton Friedman reminds us, is that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. Inflation is when there is too much money chasing too few goods in the economy, and the only institution in the United States that can increase the amount of money flowing around in the economy is, of course, the federal government. By that I mean government spending, but I also mean, of course, you mentioned the Federal Reserve and its capacity to either increase the amount of credit available or decrease the amount of credit available. And we're in a credit squeeze phase now, or at least the Fed have told us that. They've told us they're going to be doing this. And so far, they seem to have been doing it. But if you want to go back further and understand why we find ourselves in the mess that we are now, I think it's pretty clear that this is primarily a result of spending bills passed by the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration in more recent years, as well as quantitative easing. Quantitative easing was the strategy that was adopted by the Federal Reserve under Ben Bernanke for combating some of the effects of the financial crisis. And that has pumped, collectively, so to speak, that has pumped a lot of money into the economy. So while things like what is happening in Ukraine have some effects for particular goods like, as we're discovering, gas and oil and things like that, and maybe food as well, the broad cause of this problem is that it's a monetary phenomenon. And that ultimately goes back to the Federal Reserve. And it's also a spending problem, which goes back to the federal government. And of course, the problem suggests the solution. Problem suggests that, well, we need to raise interest rates. We need to drain money out of the economy. We also need to reduce spending, which I have far less confidence of happening compared to the other function, which of course will be to reduce interest rate, to raise interest rates. In fact, we've had some politicians saying, yes, we should be spending more money to try and get ourselves out of this particular problem, which tells me that either they don't understand how inflation works, or they do, but they're determined not to resort to what might be described as orthodox policies for dealing with this particular problem, which I fear is going to be with us for a while now.
Dr. Gregg, I'm curious. At some point, we'll have you define quantitative easing because it'd be helpful if you could unpack that. But I guess my question for you is, let's say we didn't have a Biden administration. Let's say this was Trump administration 2.0. You would have already had, the first round of like COVID stimulus that Trump had passed. Maybe there would have been another round. It wouldn't be surprising, but maybe not. Let's say there wasn't. You probably would have had, more ability to drill for oil, pipeline, less regulations on energy, which could certainly be helpful right now. So, in some respect, and there might be less kind of fear in the markets or less expectation that, the government is really going to cramp growth through excessive regulation. So maybe the outlook would be a little bit better. But I'm curious, one, if you think the inflation problem would still be here if we kind of just had the status quo of another Republican term. And then second, I'm curious on, so the Trump tax cuts. I'm curious on what happens if you're cutting taxes but you're not reducing spending at all.
Yes.
Right. And so you get is it true that I guess the Laffer curve idea, will we grow out of it with the increased growth, or did that not really work? Is that in any way contributing, cutting taxes without cutting spending? Does that contribute to inflation as well, because you have more money presumably chasing it?
Yes. No, I think that's right, because I think it's true to say that if you're going to be cutting taxes, which generally I think is a good thing, you wouldn't be surprised to hear me that, both corporate and personal, I think that the risk is that if you don't cut spending significantly, there's a risk that you can spark an inflationary breakout. So if you go back to let's say 1979 to 1985, which is when we had a significant inflationary breakout, bigger than what we have today. So the Reagan administration, as we all know, cut taxes. It didn't really reduce spending in a particularly significant way, but we had the Federal Reserve jacking up interest rates extremely high with the stated intention of bringing down inflation. So the fact that the Fed was acting in this particular way, I think, prevented what could have been some inflationary consequences of the Reagan administration's failure to cut spending in the way that they needed to do. In fact, they increased spending over the term of Ronald Reagan's presidency, mainly on things like defense, but nonetheless, spending grew. So I think your general point is correct, though, that when those tax cuts went through, there was not a really very much reduction in spending, but also interest rates were the lowest ever, really, certainly since we've had for a very, very long time. So those factors, I think, played in to the way that some of the things that the Trump administration did when it came to some of these things, I think probably have contributed to the inflationary outbreak. But let's take your counterfactual, which is, okay, let's say there was a Trump administration in place. There'd be a couple of things I think would happen. One is, and again, I'm just speculating, one is I think that the Federal Reserve would have moved in the direction that it's moving anyway. That's one of the reasons we have a relatively independent central bank, so that it's somewhat immune from political pressures. At the same time, I think you would have had an administration that would have been more open to reducing regulation. It would also, I suspect, have been more open to allowing more gas to be drilled, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the effects of that would have taken time, of course, but nonetheless, the signal would have been sent to the marketplace that there's more supply coming on the way. So I think if it had been a Trump administration, the situation would have been, let's say, marginally better than what we find ourselves in today. But I do think that the effects of quantitative easing and some of the other policies that were enacted before would have made the situation we're in now happen anyway, maybe to a lesser extent, and maybe it would be the case that the administration would be dealing with the problem somewhat more realistically than the Biden administration, which I don't think is really dealing with the reality of what's going on at all. I mean, when they say things like, well, this has got something to do with climate change, then you know that they're really interested in trying to distract attention from this discussion. So despite the fact that President Biden has said, well, this is really up to the Federal Reserve, they have to deal with it, etc., there's not much that he's doing that I think is likely to help the situation at present. There's really not that much. In fact, I think they're basically in denial of reality mode because the reality is so bad when it comes to inflation right now. So I'm not surprised they're behaving this particular way.
So going back in time a little bit, because you mentioned the 70s and 80s, how can the Federal Reserve tame inflation without a Volcker shock on steroids? So like, how can they tame it without an extreme rise in the interest rates that took place in that time?
Well, that is going to be an interesting question. I, myself, at this point, I would say I'm somewhat skeptical that we can avoid a recession. The Federal Reserve, Chairman Powell, has talked about generating a soft landing. But if you look back at the history of the Federal Reserve since the 1950s, there's only maybe been one or two cases where that has actually occurred and a recession has been avoided. One was in the 1990s, one was further back in time. But for the most part, engineering a soft landing, as they say, is incredibly difficult because you're really trying to make some predictions about the future that you don't really know. You also know that there's a time lag, right? There's a time lag between the effect of the Federal Reserve raising interest rates and the actual effects of that going on into the economy. So some of the effects that of the Federal Reserve's raising of interest rates won't show up in the economy for another 18 months. Now, there's market expectations that will take effect in the sense that the market will factor some of this information in when it comes to people making decisions about their investments, what they buy, whether they're going to start a business, all those sorts of things. But the time lag makes this very hard to predict. And we also need to remember just how much money has been pumped into the economy. It's really on a scale that is far bigger than anything that we saw in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where that was really the accumulation of decades of low interest rate policies for the most part. What we're seeing is the effects of quantitative easing on a scale that when Chairman Powell did it as a consequence of COVID, it dwarfed. So QE4, as it's called, dwarfed QE 1, 2, and 3 that was done under Ben Bernanke. And I think that's why we're paying a significant price for this. So I find it, at this point, I would have to say, I agree with Deutsche Bank's analysis. They were the first ones out of the gate to say, we think there's going to be a recession. I hope there isn't. No one wants a recession. But if we're going to take inflation seriously, then, and we understand just how damaging it is over the long term to all sorts of different things when it comes to prices, people making decisions about their financial futures, whether employers are going to employ more people or less people. Inflation just messes everything up. So we have every reason in the world to tackle it aggressively. But the side effect, the very probable side effect, is the likelihood of a recession. I hope we don't have it. I'd prefer that we have a soft landing, but whether the Fed can engineer that is a very, very much a crystal ball exercise.
Two more questions for you, Dr. Gregg. One, how does raising the interest rate to tame inflation, how does that affect our federal debt? Because the payments, on the debt will be presumably right with a higher interest rate. So what does that mean in terms of the national debt, if anything? And then I guess the second one is maybe if you could unpack a little bit monetary policy, what is it? What are the different schools of thought? What is the conservative approach, and how does quantitative easing fit into those respective schools?
Okay, so the first question about the federal deficit, I mean, that is very much fueled by spending more than you bring in, right? So we're not likely to see, so we will have higher interest rate payments on bonds and other such things. So that's one thing that's going to happen. But it's really a question of the amount of federal spending that goes on That's where the bulk of government spending goes on in the United States. The degree to which that has occurred over the past, it just continues to go up, right? It just I'm always amused when I hear politicians talk about, well, we've slowed down the rate of growth of government spending. So rather than, no, we've actually reduced in real terms spending. It's all about the rate of growth. That's the way they talk about it, which tells you how bad things are in this regard. So I think that's primarily a question of the amount of government spending, but also the general growth in the economy, right? So when you have growth, that generally reduces the size of the debt vis-a-vis GDP. It makes it easier for the government to repay loans, etc. So I'm not sure that the interest rate issue is going to have that much of an effect. You mentioned the point about monetary policy. Well, in the United States, the Federal Reserve, in terms of monetary policy, basically has what's called a dual mandate. And the dual mandate, and you go to their website, it's all there. It basically says it's stable money, or price stability as we call it, but also what they call maximum employment. So what that means, and this goes back to legislation that was passed in the 1970s, which basically represented a compromise between conservative Republicans and progressive Democrats about what they thought monetary policy should be about. And they basically both got what they wanted, right? So they got this price stability as a priority, but guess what? Maximum employment is also a priority, which gives the Federal Reserve the capacity to basically do whatever it wants, and it can appeal to whatever part of the mandate they think most justifies what they happen to be doing. So a conservative approach, and I think this is pretty much true of most people who describe themselves as fiscal conservatives, whether they're a Chicago school person or a Hayekian or whatever type of conservative economic position they tend to hold, they would say that the priority should always be price stability, because price stability is integral to the price mechanism performing its magic in the economy. When you don't have price stability, people's willingness to lend credit, people's willingness to borrow, people's willingness to start businesses, to be entrepreneurial, to take on more employees, etc., or even what they buy in the stores, right? When you don't have price stability, it really messes everything up in terms of the ability of prices to perform the signaling function that they do. In other words, the criteria that we use to make value judgments about what we want to buy and sell, the criteria is no longer stable, which means it's much, much harder to make the types of concrete decisions that we like. And so a conservative would say this is really important for the long term. So I think conservative monetary policy is all about the long term. We're always thinking about not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, not this political cycle, but over the next 10 to 20 years. A progressive would say, to quote John Maynard Keynes, in the long run, we're all dead. We just take Keynes out of context a little bit, but it does make the point that progressive approaches to monetary policy is that it's primarily about stimulating and directing the economy to stimulate growth in that particular way. And of course, the conservative would say, well, there's a big risk of doing that because the big risk associated with that is you're going to have inflationary problems. So that's basically the conservative position on monetary policy. Someone who calls themselves a fiscal conservative will generally say price stability is the priority. Quantitative easing, the thing you just mentioned. So this is an experiment that really started in 2008, 2009. It was really a hallmark of the Bernanke Fed's wrestling with the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent Great Recession. So quantitative easing, QE as it's called, is the central bank. It buys bonds and other financial assets to inject money into the economy, And the idea is that by doing this, the economy keeps ticking over, that the stimulus that should be coming from the private sector but isn't will basically be replaced by this. And it's generally something that's used in let's call it severe recessions. So it was used basically when Bernanke was Federal Reserve Chairman for his tenure. By 2012, 2013, there are enough people on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors or on what's called the Federal Open Markets Committee, FOMOC, as the acronym goes. There are enough people on that who started saying, this is this is a problem. We think that quantitative easing actually benefits particular groups over others. So it benefits borrowers over savers. It benefits investors over non-investors. It risks creating asset bubbles, and it distorts capital market signals. So it sort of came to an end in the first part of the 2010s, but then it was fired up again as a consequence of COVID. Now, Ben Bernanke has actually just written a book called 21st Century Monetary Policy, in which he engages in a significant defense of QE. And he says, look, it really helped America to get back in shape after the 2008 recession. It helped sustain America's economy during the pandemic. And then interestingly in the book, he says, and these policies have not led, quote unquote, have not led to sustained excessive inflation. Well, well, guess what? It has. It has now. And I think it's safe to say that when the Federal Reserve started tapering the pace of its asset purchases, which is really how quantitative easing is implemented back in November 2021, and then doubling down on the tapering of its pace of asset purchases the next month in December 2021, I think that was very much enough people on the Federal Open Markets Committee, members of that committee concluding that QE had contributed to the accelerating and damaging inflation rate, which gradually started to engulf the economy in April last year.
So something I think that's worth probably defining, especially for students and even myself, who we were probably in grade school during the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008. And it seems that a lot of Wall Street heavyweights, as you mentioned, have already sounded the alarm on an impending recession. Could you unpack what exactly that means, especially in the economic context of today?
So what would a recession look like? That's what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay. Well, a recession, of course, is the technical definition is 2 quarters of negative growth. So you can have mild recession. So if you have a negative 0.1% growth, and then you have another month is 0.2% negative growth, well, that would be considered a mild recession. A severe recession would be something like 2, 3, 4% negative growth over 2 consecutive quarters. So that's the technical definition. So what would that mean? Well, it means less growth. Less growth translates into less businesses being started. It also translates into generally some increase in the level of unemployment. It also generally translates into a reduction of consumer spending. It also means that banks and other purveyors of credit stop lending as much money because they become less confident that the loans will be repaid. So it's more than just a slowdown. It means that the things that fuel growth, particularly things like entrepreneurship, right? Because in context of a recession, entrepreneurs generally find it hard to get the credit they need to start a business. They also become more reluctant to be economically creative because in the conditions of a recession, the odds of failure just go up exponentially. So I think that that's basically the characteristics of a recession, and it will have dramatic effects upon things like not just growth, but as a consequence of growth, employment levels, levels of credit, numbers of businesses starting, consumer spending. And politically, it generally translates into people getting very angry at whoever is deemed to be responsible. And whether it's true or not, the person or the group that tends to be held responsible is usually whoever is president at the time. So you can understand at the moment why the Biden administration, I think, is really purveying a type of non-reality when it comes to talking about inflation, because they know, based on historical experience, that this is going to be something that voters will generally punish whoever happens to be in power at the time, whoever is deemed to be responsible for this, regardless of whether they are actually responsible. So it's a bleak time. Now, hopefully these things don't last too long. They typically, the strength of the American economy is such that these things generally don't last for super long periods of time, usually 2-3 months. But that in itself often generates reactions from governments and central banks that might help to fix the problem in the short to medium term, but also perhaps store up longer term problems for the future, whether it's lowering interest rates or where it comes to things like increasing government spending. That's typically how a lot of governments respond to recessions. That's a very sort of Keynesian approach to approaching the problem of recessions. And that might stimulate the economy in some respects, but you pay a price for that further down the line.
Dr. Gregg, I'm wanting to maybe go back in time a bit to the 19th century and talk about political economy, kind of looking at, and this is probably a very crude sort of analysis, but like broadly speaking, like the Jeffersonian tradition, the Hamiltonian tradition, throughout American history, you saw obviously with Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, he was more bullish on a industrial policy, on a central bank, things like that. You had Jefferson, who was more skeptical of those things, who perhaps would have wanted to undo some of what Hamilton did, but wasn't really able to do that. You have, the fight between Jackson and Clay being the American system guy, Jackson wanting to fight back against crony capitalism. With the Civil War, you have sort of the consolidation in the Republican Party around Lincoln, sort of, he's sort of a Henry Clay Whig, and there's more of a, I would say that sort of more of a centralized approach, at least when it comes to industry and tariffs like that, dominate the 19th century. So I'm curious from your perspective, maybe looking at this through two angles, sort of from the classical liberal tradition. I don't know, what would Adam Smith have to say looking forward at sort of what happened in the 20th century? Like, which of these schools of thought would he most resonate with? What do you see Adam Smith looking forward, saying about how things shaked out in 19th century America? And then maybe looking backwards, did Hayek, for example, or the Austrian school comment at all on these sort of differences between the Jeffersonian tradition and the Hamiltonian tradition in America?
Well, let me start with the last point. I think it's fair to say that Hayek himself didn't write that much about this particular issue. I think Ludwig von Mises, wrote some things about some of the economic policies that preceded and followed the Civil War. He may have said some things about Hamilton and Jefferson and the very different visions of political economy that they brought to the table. So I'm not sure the Austrians would have a view about what they should be happening today. I don't count myself necessarily as an Austrian, but I think they have some particularly good insights into things like business cycle theory and the way that central banking and some of the problems associated with central banking, the way that they tend to exacerbate the business cycle ups and downs in ways that make the business cycle, far from managing the business cycle particularly well, I think they end up the Austrians would say that central banks actually end up making the situation much more volatile, which is ironic because they exist, to sort of manage the monetary side. And I guess an Austrian would say that central banks are generally pretty lousy at doing that because they suffer from the same problem as any sort of centralized economic institution, which is the inability to know what's going to be happening in the future. And when you act in light of that knowledge, you end up making big mistakes that have very big implications and ramifications across the economy as a whole. When it comes to the 19th century, people talk about American political economy as if there's one type of American political economy. But as I think you just showed, the 19th century was one in which debates about political economy, whether it's things like you mentioned, having a national bank, for example, or the whole debate about tariffs, or the debate about things like industrial policy. After the issue of slavery, I would argue that some of these questions were among the most important and heavily debated issues all through the 19th century and even into the 20th century and up until now. So many of the debates that we see that are going on about these questions today on the right, but also now I think that some of these things are happening on the left as well. They're not new discussions. These are discussions that have been going on for a very, very long time about these particular questions. So in terms of what Adam Smith would say, you mentioned him. Well, of course, he's the great thinker when it comes to thinking about political economy in the modern classical sense of that particular expression. And he interestingly had some observations about the United States. He spends quite a bit of time in the Wealth of Nations talking about the United States. Now, that's partly because there's a war of independence going on. The Wealth of Nations comes out in 1776, which is the same year that America declares its independence. And the whole issue of the relationship between Great Britain and its colonies is one that's on people's minds. So we shouldn't be surprised that we find Adam Smith commenting on these issues and the future of American economic life. And what's interesting about it is that he says that some of the measures adopted by Britain, such as the Navigation Acts, for example, which were very much a type of mercantilist measure that were designed for defense purposes, but nonetheless had some pretty significant economic implications. He thought that some of those measures would eventually, even though he actually supported them, he actually was a supporter of the Navigation Acts, even though he supported them, he said, I think in the long term, these things, like most of these policies, are going to drive some pretty significant wedges between the American colonies and Great Britain, to the extent that I suspect that this could be some of the things that caused the United States to eventually separate themselves in the sense of sovereign states from Great Britain. So that's one thing that he certainly said. He also pointed out, he was very aware, as many people were at the time, that some of the disputes about trade issues lay at the heart of some of the reasons why particular American colonists wanted their independence, right? Because remember, a lot of the debates were about things like American colonists being forced to accept tea imports from the East India Company, right? So this is one of the reasons why the tea got tipped into the harbor in Boston, right? So he pointed out that some of the mercantilist policies, and the East India Company was a mercantilist enterprise par excellence, we're going to have some very negative effects upon trade relations between Britain and its North American colonies. So I think that, it's difficult to say what Smith would say about some of the specifics of today, but I think it's very clear that he would say that he would not think that protectionism is an answer to some of the problems that we face today. He was generally a skeptic about industrial policy. Now, that's not to say he was a sort of a person who believed that the state should be as minimal as possible. He thought there were very important things that the state should do, things like national defense, foreign policy. He was in favor of public works, etc. And he had some exceptions that he was willing to make for his general commitment to free trade based on what he regarded as what we would call national security grounds. But my suspicion is that his prescription for us would be the same that he offered in his own time, because the prescriptions that he was offering, he didn't view them as historically bound. He viewed these things as pointing to some significant economic truths that hold true regardless of time, place, culture, and historical situation.
So I want to pivot a little bit because an observation that I think a lot of Americans have made especially is that when you walk past a restaurant or really any place that would have service industry jobs today, is there's always help wanted signs, especially after COVID. And the kind of the term Great Resignation has come up, but also the Great Reshuffle. So I'm curious, what are the causes of the so-called labor shortage? Is it a labor shortage? And do you think either of those characterizations accurately encapsulate what we're seeing occurring?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the Great Resignation, I think, is a real thing. It's very clear that COVID, and perhaps more particularly government responses to COVID in the form of lockdowns, gave a lot of people pause for thought about what they wanted to do with their lives. It was, if you like, a type of sudden psychological break that they got to sit back and think about, well, is this really what I want to do with my life? And some people decided that they wanted not to be working. And some people were in a position where they could make those types of choices, either because they had a spouse who was working or they had savings. So what's interesting about that is that I do think there were a lot of people who decided just to take a pause. So that's one thing. Another thing, though, was that some of this was, of course, stimulated by the fact that the federal government and some state governments were basically making it financially viable for people to do that. I'm sure you know or have talked to small business owners, for example, who certainly said things to me like, well, I've tried to rehire some of my old staff, but I can't pay them what I would need to pay them if I'm going to match, let alone pay more than what they're getting from the federal government. So I think that's a very classic example of government intervention in the form of direct payments to people, essentially contributing to this problem we have of particular industries experiencing some of these problems. Now, I would also mention, you mentioned hospitality. I think it's fair to say that not every segment of the economy is experiencing this. And that's true at most times, right? Employment levels tend to vary in different sectors of the economy at most times. But it's certainly true in things like hospitality. There's been a significant fall off when it comes to just the number of people who are willing to work. Now, it might be that people starting to think about the possibility of a recession, the fact that the unemployment numbers are starting to gradually creep up, albeit not by very much, but the unemployment level is starting to grow again, that may cause some people to rethink some of the decisions they made in 2020, 2021. But another problem, of course, is that I think that the Biden administration is not making it particularly easy in this regard because it's increasing the amount of regulation that applies when it comes to hiring people, right? So, yes, businesses need more workers in many segments of the economy, but it's also true that the whole process of hiring is just getting harder and harder and harder. I also think that one thing that's going to play into all this is that a lot of employers who now are presently experiencing labor shortages, because they are thinking that there is the prospect of a recession on the horizon, they may slow down the sheer degree of energy they're putting in right now to the number of hires that they want to make. So we are in a strange situation where we have low growth, yet also very low unemployment and increasing inflation. But I think some of the reasons I've given help to explain why that is the case. And I'm not sure it's going to last. I should add that. I'm not sure that this low unemployment rate is going to last if some of these other factors that we've talked about today start to play in to the workings of the economy at the present moment.
Dr. Gregg, so you just accepted a new position with AIER, working with one of my former board members, Will Ruger, who I have a lot of respect for. I'm curious, you're leading a new initiative, which is described in part as, quote, tackling the rise of collectivist challenges to a free society, whether they come from the political left or right. I think we all know what the challenges from the political left are when it comes to the economy. I'm curious, as you survey the burgeoning, let's call it the national conservatism movement or the new right, what are your biggest areas of concern when it comes to economic policy? And are there any areas, perhaps China, for example, where you might have more sympathy than others?
Sure. Well, I think it's fair to say that I'm skeptical about the economic nationalism that I see on some segments of the right. Now, I should add, not everyone who describes themselves as a national conservative is an economic nationalist. I know people who describe themselves as national conservatives who are very much sort of more or less in a free market position. They really haven't changed their views on economic issues. But by economic nationalism, I mean things like protectionism. I mean the extensive use of industrial policy to try and basically outguess the market when it comes to shaping different segments of the economy and where growth happens and where it doesn't, where employment happens, and the way that those things emerge. I'm very skeptical of those things insofar as I don't think they work. And I think they generally have some very negative side effects, some of which are economic, but some of which are also political, because I think that economic nationalism, just looking at it politically, tends to fuel things like cronyism, tends to fuel things like the closeness of more and more businesses to government and the desire to get close to government to try and get subsidies and favors and tariffs that favor them, rather than focusing upon what they should be doing, which is delivering goods and services to consumers, 330 million American consumers in the marketplace. So I think that's where I see some of the economic challenges. On the political level, I very much believe in a notion like the common good. I believe that is a real thing. I can even give you a philosophical explanation of what I think that means. And I've noticed that on some segments of the right, the use of the language of common good has come back into play. But I also think that the common good, properly understood, particularly the political common good, actually puts down principled limits upon what the state should be doing. Because I think that when you look at the way that some people on the right are talking about the common good, it seems to function as a type of argument, a philosophical and political argument in favor of the government doing more things. And I think, and I've written about this in a number of places, including in some publications that I suspect would describe themselves as being on the new right, suggesting that the common good, particularly properly understood, particularly in the natural law tradition from which it emerges, I think lends itself to a vision of limited government rather than expanded government. There's a reason why Thomas Aquinas was often called the first Whig, W-H-I-G. And the reason is because I think that's where you find in his work the first really principled outline of why a concern for the common good and for human flourishing and freedom and justice and equality properly understood all lend themselves to a vision of government as having certain responsibilities, very important responsibilities, but also limited responsibilities. Now, you mentioned China. China, of course, has obviously thrown a ratchet into many of the assumptions that many people on the right, particularly the free market right, had made about China's integration into the global economy. The assumption, as you know, was that if China enters into the global economy in the way that it was allowed to do so in 2001 when it acceded to the WTO, the working assumption of the time, which was very much in the air and fueled to a certain extent by the work of people like Francis Fukuyama, was that once you buy into economic liberty, you tend to find political liberty expanding also. Well, what's interesting about that is that I was always somewhat skeptical of that, but I was willing to see what would happen. But what's interesting about that is that people like Adam Smith and David Hume, who are very much believers in free trade, never believed that economic liberalization necessarily or inevitably translated into political liberalization. So I think this has been a very important corrective, and it's caused a lot of people on the free market right, where I number myself, to go back and look at how classical thinkers in the free market tradition thought about these issues. And it's very clear that they don't and didn't believe that free trade, economic liberalization necessarily was going to make a country like China just like us. 5,000 years of authoritarian rule and a particularly hierarchical view of authority, that's going to take a long time to change in a country like China. So I think some of these political and cultural and historical facts and realities have meant that we've had to seriously rethink how we think about China as a player in the global economy. Now, I happen to think, and I've written this in a number of places, that protectionism is not an adequate response to this. In fact, I think it tends to hurt America more than China if we went down that. Well, we've gone down that path to a certain extent with the Trump administration and with the Biden administration. And I think it's fair to say that these protectionist measures have not caused China to change its behavior. And it's actually resulted in considerable job losses in the United States, and particularly in, curiously enough, some parts of the manufacturing sector. When it comes to things like industrial policy, I think that the flaws of industrial policy, even if it's adopted in response to dealing with a problem like China, I don't think it's necessarily going to fix some of those problems. In fact, I think it could end up having some very significant negative side effects throughout the economy as a whole. Now, that all said, it's very clear that there's areas where we need to rethink our position vis-a-vis China and economics and free trade from a national security standpoint. Now, the good news is that there has been legislation introduced and passed, particularly towards the end of President Trump's term, which, for example, makes Chinese companies that want to register on Wall Street, they have to disclose things now that they didn't have to disclose before. Things like, are you owned by the Communist Party? Do you have Communist Party members on your board, etc.? And it's not saying that if you do, we're not going to let you invest. It's just that we want to know. They're also forcing Chinese companies working in the United States to disclose their financials, which was not really happening up until 2020. We've also seen particular companies that have engaged in industrial espionage, particular Chinese companies that are either fully owned or partly owned or associated with the Chinese Communist Party. We're finding quite a number of those are being blacklisted because they've engaged in theft and industrial espionage. All those things I think are perfectly acceptable because I think national security is obviously, as Adam Smith said, something that trumps free trade. But also you can do these things in such a way that you deal with individual bad actors without giving up all the benefits that come from trading with an economy that, whether we like it or not, is either the second or third biggest economy in the world and has 1.4 billion consumers in it. So this is the real challenge, I think, for those who, like myself, are very much free traders, free marketers, etc., is to think very carefully about how one integrates these genuine concerns for national security, which I share. I share those concerns. I'm an American. How could I not share those concerns? But to do it in such a way that the real benefits of trade liberalization and free trade for America, and that's how I tend to talk about it. I believe in free trade because I think it's good for America. How do we do that in such a way? How do we take into account these national security concerns in a way that doesn't involve us doing damage to ourselves?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gregg, for joining us today and explaining these extremely important matters to us. I'm sure a lot of our listeners and even myself will derive a lot of value out of this in navigating the economy. And unfortunately, we are out of time. So if people are interested in seeing more of your work or following you, where can they find you?
Well, in the future, it will be on the American Institute for Economic Research's website. That's very easily found. But I write in publications ranging from National Review to the American Mind to Law and Liberty, etc. And if you Google my name, you'll find lots of these things coming up, particularly over the past, I guess, really 7 years, where I've spent most of my time thinking about and writing about these questions of political economy. And I'd also recommend that in September 2022, they pick up a copy of my new book, which will be out that month, called The Next American Economy: Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World.
And is that book available for pre-order yet?
You can pre-order it on Amazon right now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Gregg. Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.